Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today and share a little bit more information about Immunovia. We are a Swedish company focused on saving lives through the early detection of pancreatic cancer and doing that with a simple blood test. I'll start with a quick introduction to the company. We'll talk a little bit more about the opportunity that we see in pancreatic cancer and the real need within the market. We'll spend most of our time actually talking about the tests that we have developed for detecting pancreatic cancer early. And then we'll also talk about some of our progress and next steps, as well as a capital raising opportunity that we're currently undertaking. Immunovia has been a company since 2007. We are publicly traded on the NASDAQ Stockholm, and the company has undergone a number of changes over the years. Some of you may be familiar with the company, and the reality is that we are quite a different company than we were 12 to 15 months ago. Today, we are a lean, focused diagnostics company that is very focused on pancreatic cancer very specifically. And we have the expertise, the skills, the experience, and the relationships to be successful in this market. As I mentioned, we see a significant unmet need in the early detection of pancreatic cancer and a real desire for a simple blood test to do that. We have developed and completed development of a very high performance test, which will enable clinicians to detect pancreatic cancer at stage 1 and 2. I'll share that performance with you today. One of the things that we won't talk a lot about, but is a real asset for us, is the biobank that we have that has over 8,000 samples in it. These are blood samples from people who either have pancreatic cancer or are at risk for pancreatic cancer. Having this biobank enables us to move very quickly through the development process, and it is fueling our clinical studies that will make us able to get to the market sooner than would otherwise be possible. Another advantage that we have because of our legacy in this market is the very strong, very productive relationships that we have with key pancreatic cancer centers across the country and across Europe and the US. Because of these relationships, we can conduct research more effectively, we can do it more quickly, and these key opinion leaders in pancreatic cancer centers have become real advocates for Immunovia. I mentioned that we're a very different company than we were over the years. One of the things that I've done since becoming CEO in July of 2023 is to implement a number of changes to make the organization much smaller, much more cost-effective, more productive, and I've done that by blending the talents of the existing Immunovia team and some of the top performers on that team with some new people who have come in with specific expertise that we need to move the company forward. So with that introduction, let's talk a little bit more about the unmet need. As I mentioned, we are very focused on pancreatic cancer. This is a rare cancer, but an incredibly deadly cancer. Despite the fact that it is uncommon, it is the third leading cause of cancer death, both in Europe and in the US. And why is that? Well, unfortunately, the survival rate for those who are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer is truly terrible. Only 13% of people who are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer will be alive 5 years later. The reason for that is that people get diagnosed too late in the process. Pancreatic cancer symptoms don't often show up until a person is at stage 3 or stage 4 disease. By that point, a clinician's options are limited. They can't do surgery. There are certain therapeutic options that are no longer available. And as a result, the 5-year survival rate for people who are diagnosed late is only 3%. Conversely, the survival rate is more than 10 times higher for those that get diagnosed early, those who are diagnosed at stage 1 and stage 2. The challenge for us and for the market is that only 1 out of 5 people diagnosed with pancreatic cancer actually gets diagnosed at stage 1 or at stage 2 when surgery is still an option and when that survival rate approaches 50%. So that's our challenge. As we think about how to impact that survival rate, we're very focused on high-risk individuals who have various factors that put them at high risk for pancreatic cancer. On this chart, you can see those groups. On the left, people who have new onset diabetes. That's basically people over the age of 50 that get diagnosed with diabetes later in life. There's also a large number of people, about 600,000 patients, both in the US and in Europe, who have family history of pancreatic cancer or genetic mutations that put them at high risk. There are also people who are at high risk because of chronic pancreatitis or because they have certain cysts in their pancreas. Together, these groups comprise about 1.8 million people in the US, which is our initial commercial market, and the size of the European market is about the same. The market's not only large, but it's growing. It's growing for a few factors, and you see them here. The first is that new onset diabetes is increasing dramatically. In addition, I mentioned that people with genetic risk factors are often at higher risk of pancreatic cancer. Because we're doing more hereditary cancer testing, especially in the US, we're identifying more and more of those people who have problems in their genetic code that make them more likely to get pancreatic cancer. And then the final thing I'll say is that there are a lot of people who we don't even know, we don't realize that they are at high risk until they get pancreatic cancer. These are called sporadic cases. There are a number of institutions that are using artificial intelligence to be able to comb through medical records and identify those people who seem to have risk factors that put them at higher risk for getting pancreatic cancer over the next 2 to 3 years. All of these groups are people who would be fantastic candidates for the Immunovia early detection test. And what are we trying to accomplish with that test? Well, quite simply, we want to bring a test to market that does a few things. It allows us to bring more at-risk people into surveillance. Today, we know that only 20% of people who are at high risk for surveillance actually go every year or every 6 months to get checked out. We can make that dramatically higher because a simple blood test is a lot easier to do than the current approach, which is imaging either with an MRI or with an endoscopic ultrasound. Both of those processes are expensive. They require people to take either a half day or a full day off work, and there can be risks associated with them. The final thing is that we believe that we can reduce cancers that happen in between when people go for surveillance appointments, because with a blood test, we can do that test more frequently, every 3 to 6 months if necessary. Where are we in this process? So we've already accomplished quite a bit since we pivoted the company to focus on our next generation test in the fourth quarter of 2022. During the time since then, we have completed our research and development efforts. We now have a well-defined test. We know what biomarkers we're going to use in that test. And in the rest of this year, 2024, we'll be doing both some internal work within our lab called analytical validation to make sure that we're measuring all of the proteins especially well. And then the second thing that we'll be doing is a clinical validation test. And that essentially means we want to do one more study that shows that the results that we've already gotten are repeatable in a different population and in a larger study. The results that we've seen with the test so far have been truly fantastic. The test has delivered 98% specificity and 85% sensitivity. And I'll explain more about what those numbers mean in just a second. I think it's also important to note that this test has proven to be significantly more accurate than CA19-9, which is really the only test that's available today that uses blood to look for pancreatic cancer. So we've developed a test that not only on its own performs at a very high level, but it also outperforms the current test that's being used. So I mentioned that we have 85% sensitivity. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if we are conducting a test in people who actually do have pancreatic cancer, we will find that cancer 85% of the time. Or said differently, for every 7 people we test who actually have pancreatic cancer, we will find it in 6 out of 7 patients. That result is really important because, again, we're focused on stage 1 and stage 2 pancreatic cancer. This is very early, it's difficult to detect. And so to be able to detect it 85% of the time is a result that has gotten tremendous feedback from the clinicians that we've spoken to about this. In addition, it's important that the test is specific. That means that we aren't going to generate false positives when we test people who don't have pancreatic cancer. You can imagine that if someone doesn't have pancreatic cancer and we produce a result that indicates that they do, that leads to a lot of additional follow-up testing and quite a bit of fear and anxiety for that patient. The reality, though, is that with 98% specificity, if we test 50 people and none of them have pancreatic cancer, we will only produce 1 false positive out of those 50 patients that we test. The other 49 will identify as non-pancreatic cancer cases correctly. This accuracy with our test, this sensitivity and specificity, compares very favorably to those imaging approaches that I talked about earlier. So the data on the right here shows the sensitivity and specificity of these different imaging technologies. And what you can see is that with our next generation test, we've got sensitivity and specificity that stacks up very well compared to those imaging tests. And in addition, it's a lot more convenient. It's a simple blood test. It takes minutes rather than hours. And it can be done in a wide range of places rather than having to go to an expert center. Finally, it's a lot cheaper. It's a simple blood test, which is less expensive than something like an endoscopic ultrasound, which requires going to a hospital, getting put under anesthetic, and having a procedure done by a clinician. As we think about what comes next for us, I mentioned that we are currently working on the analytical validation of our test. We'll then move to the clinical validation, where we just confirm that those accuracy numbers that I shared really do come through in an additional study. And in 2025, we'll move on to the commercial phase of our program, and we'll continue to do additional studies that will support reimbursement. It's important that we have not only an ability to drive adoption and use of our test, we also want to make sure that we're generating revenue for the testing that we do. That's where reimbursement comes in. What we need to do is generate clinical data that we can take to government payers as well as private payers in the US to convince them that this is a test that they should reimburse us to complete. Part of what we want to do to drive the commercialization effort is to secure a commercial partner, and we expect to move forward with that effort once we complete the clinical validation study that we're doing in the fourth quarter of this year. For a company at our stage, it's very important that we focus on our cash, what is our burn rate, and how much runway do we have. So as of the end of the second quarter, at the end of June, we had a cash balance of 37 million SEK. We are burning about 8 to 9 million SEK per month. That is in line with previous guidance. It's also down dramatically from where it was 15 to 18 months ago. As a company, we went through a pretty dramatic transformation to get much smaller, much more cost effective, and to really reduce that cash burn rate. We have a rights issue that we will be talking about in just a minute, and we expect that the cash that we have right now, together with the proceeds from that rights issue, will take us through 2024 and into 2025. The rights issue that we are conducting is actually well underway, and in fact, we are in the subscription period for that rights issue right now. It started on August 16 and continues through the 30th, so just to the end of this week. What we're seeking to do is to raise 70 million SEK. We've secured this rights issue at a level of 50%, so we know that at a minimum we'll get 35 million Swedish krona. And we're very excited to offer attractive terms to investors who participate in the rights issue. For those who participate, you'll not only receive 2 shares of Immunovia stock, but we will also be doing 2 warrant series. So you'll receive 2 warrants in the TO2 tranche and 1 warrant in the TO3 tranche. Those warrant series will be available to shareholders in January and in March/April of next year. We'd love to have you learn more about the rights issue and how we're going to use the cash and really what the opportunity is with Immunovia as we look to bring this high performance test for early detection of pancreatic cancer to market. If you want to learn more, you can go to rightsissue.immunovia.com. It's a website that has quite a bit of information about the company, about our next generation test, as well as about the rights issue itself. And you can see FAQs and more information about how to participate. I mentioned earlier that we have pulled together a very high performance team. It is a small group. We literally have less than 12 full-time employees at Immunovia, but it is a very seasoned group and a group that has had a track record of success across a number of highly relevant companies in bringing similar products to market, whether that was done at companies like Myriad Genetics, Metabolon, and LabCorp, as well as Foundation Medicine. In short, we feel very, very strongly that this is an incredible opportunity to deliver against an unmet clinical need in the market. We've got a high performance test that's going to meet that need. We have advantages as a company because of our long history in pancreatic cancer, and we have the right team to do it. So certainly would appreciate you taking the opportunity to learn more about the rights issue that we're conducting to see if it might be the right fit for your portfolio. And with that, we'll see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Promising results on the new test. I believe it was 85% sensitivity and 98% specificity.
Correct.
And if you compare that to the first generation test, what was the figures on that one?
So it's a little bit tough to compare because there are advantages of this test that we didn't have with the first generation test. One of the biggest ones is that with this test, we either give a yes or a no answer. So with our first generation test, about 10 to 12% of patients were classified as borderline, which meant that we were really having a hard time deciding, are they pancreatic cancer or not? So if you only look at the positive and the negative, the results are similar, but we've been able to eliminate that 10 to 12% that got a response of non-determinate. In addition, when we compared our prior tests to CA19-9, which is sort of that blood test that's in the market, previously we didn't see a significant difference. Here we saw a 20 percentage point increase in sensitivity with the new test. So we really feel good about the performance of the test. I think it made the right decision to focus our energies and resources on that next generation test.
Do you believe this test can be used and that you can skip MRI or CT, or will those two be necessary still?
I think that what this test will do is take the place of imaging on a fairly regular basis. So currently, people have to go every year for testing with those imaging approaches. What we envision will happen in the future is that you might get and endoscopic ultrasound every 2 years or every 3 years. Or if you're especially high risk, maybe you'll get it every year, but in between, you'll be getting regular blood tests with the Immunovia next generation test to determine, do you have that risk that needs to be further explored.
And you mentioned partners. What are you looking for in a partner?
Yeah, what we want to do is identify large diagnostics companies that have an existing sales team, they have an existing commercial team that will allow us to essentially put our test into that infrastructure. That gives us a couple of advantages. One is certainly from a cost standpoint, it dramatically reduces our cash burn and the expenses that we would have every month. But it also allows us to tap into the expertise and the relationships that partner will have. So we've begun those discussions. We're in contact with a number of promising potential partners. The key for us is just going to be to complete that clinical validation work. That's really the trigger that we think will be necessary to have serious conversations with those partners.
And can you mention a little bit about the competitive landscape? Because I remember Grail as a competitor.
Yes. So, we talked a little bit about the, imaging as a competitor, and I think that's an important point because even though it's not a blood test, that is used today. So we see real advantages with the cost of our test and the convenience. When it comes to other blood tests that are in development, there are really two categories. One category are the multi-cancer early detection tests, like the Grail test, which basically look not just for pancreatic cancer, but for other cancers as well. The real difference is that those cancer tests struggle to identify pancreatic cancer early. The data that Grail has published with their test in pancreatic cancer indicates that their sensitivity is 60%. So whereas we would identify 6 out of 7 people who have pancreatic cancer, conversely, with Grail, you'd miss 2 out of every 5 cases that you saw. So we see that there's a clear advantage there. There are some other companies that are developing pancreatic cancer specific tests, but we think because of the fact that we've got very high accuracy, that sensitivity and specificity, and also because of the fact that we've got a lead in the market and hope to beat a market sooner, we really think we can really be successful there.
Have you discussed any price point for the new generation test?
It's a good question. I would suspect that in our first market in the US, a reasonable expectation is probably somewhere between $800 and $900. So, somewhere around 8,000 to 9,000 SEK is probably a fairly reasonable assumption.
All right. And do you see potential to develop a new test in other cancer areas, or are you sticking with pancreatic cancer?
Yeah, I would say in the near term and in the intermediate term, we will absolutely stick with pancreatic cancer. The reason for that is that there's a huge unmet need and there's not very many companies that are focused on it. If you look in the diagnostics market, you have a number of very large players, and they tend to focus on either multi-cancer detection, lung cancer, or colorectal cancer. So colorectal cancer, lung cancer, those are those top 2 cancer killers, but there's very little focus on the third, pancreatic cancer. And so we see a real opportunity to focus there and to really own that market.
Thanks, Jeff, and good luck ahead.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.